So we're at the 2015 ACSA Distillers Convention and Vendor Trade Show here in Austin, Texas. I'm talking with Harry Kohlmann. He is the CEO of Park Street. What is Park Street?
So Park Street is the leading back office provider for small and medium-sized alcoholic beverage brands in the United States. So we do everything from compliance, logistics, accounting, customer service, factoring for small and medium-sized companies in the United States that are trying to navigate in this relatively complicated market and make it pretty simple for themselves.
And we were listening to your great seminar earlier. You were talking about the growth of craft brands, and that's a question that we're asked a lot. How is the growth, affecting larger brands? What is the growth like? Tell us about that.
So overall, we're seeing, in the marketplace that the larger suppliers and the larger brands are not growing anymore in line with the market. Overall, there's, a slowdown. While the overall market is growing, so who's gaining? It's not the lower end, medium-sized brands. It's actually the higher end, smaller brands, and they're gaining rapidly. So when we look at, a category like gin, we see that, in this particular category, the small to medium-sized premium brands are outgrowing the larger brands and the brands of the larger suppliers by a factor of 5 to 10 times. So basically, like half of the industry growth is attributable to less than 3% of the total industry, which is tremendous.
So less than 3% of the total industry is craft.
That's correct. Oh, it's smaller brands. It's from with a lack of a craft definition. It's very difficult to say like who's really craft, who's not. But it's basically brands that have less than 1% market share, and they're growing rapidly.
So when we say if a brand has less than 1% of a market share, we're talking about like gin, for example, or bourbon, or whatever it might be. They only have less than 1% of that total market within that given category.
That's correct.
When did this start? When did you start seeing the growth going to the craft versus the bigger brand? When did you actually see it?
I mean, like the overall, like over the last 20 years, you see a premiumization trend. So that smaller brands took share from larger brands and then became big. That has been happening, but that it's happening on a larger scale. That it's fragmented, meaning that many brands in a category are suddenly breaking through. That one I think is a newer phenomenon, and it's doubly attributable to a bunch of distillers coming in. So when we look at the number of licenses for distilled spirits over the last 7 years, more than tripled. So, and the number of label filings, etc., increased dramatically from them. So they had like 3% of the filings, 7 years ago, and now it's 20%. So overall, smaller players are more successful, but that doesn't mean that they're going to be necessarily on a larger scale on a national level. But they own much larger shares on a local and regional level. So when we say it's like, on the national level, they might have a market share around 3%, in a particular local market, they might have a much larger market share.
How are the bigger brands responding? I mean, how are they? What is their strategy going to become?
I mean, like overall, like the large brands, the large suppliers, they're working their market power. They have dollars. They have a lot of market power. They're trying to defend themselves. They're trying to appeal to consumer taste, consumer preferences. They are trying to possibly borrow some interest from craft players in a way where they try to put certain annotations in place that would give them a kind of like a craftier look.
Right.
They will try to have differentiated marketing campaigns that appeal to certain target consumers. They try to use new avenues on the marketing side, with the internet, with different, social media, Instagram campaigns, etc. They're trying everything they can. The problem is, once you're too big, by definition, you might have a really, really hard barrier to overcome. So on the craft side, right now you have a lot of codes that are kind of like vague, and it's not pretty clear of like who's in, who's out. The question for the industry is, at one point, are you going to make a difference by trying to stake it in and say who's in, who's out? It's very difficult. We heard earlier today from the Brewer Association, the difficulties they had when they went through this. It's not an easy question because you don't want to, especially when you start off as an association, you don't want to take anybody out. You have like some successful examples that might not fall into your definition, but they should be valuable members. So it's a fine balancing act. But overall, from a consumer perspective, you want to make sure that you protect the territory to not dilute the element of craft too much, that in a few years the consumer moves on and tries to find something else, because if everybody's craft, nobody's craft.
Over 7 years, it's tripled. How many filings have there been since?
I mean, like on the distiller side, we had like, you know, it's over 1,500. According to Distillers, that basically came out with some numbers a few weeks ago, they had, I think, 712 different distillers that had an average volume of 3,000, and I think it was a number of around 20 that had an average number of around 80,000 cases. So that's how they came up with a number of around 3.5 million cases for 2014.
So the big question, of course, as craft continues to grow, its categories, again, we see it here this weekend at the conference and trade show, it's bigger and bigger. At what point will the growth stop? At what point will we be maxed out of craft distillers? What do you think? When you look back and think about the last craft boom that we had, which was right after Prohibition. Right after Prohibition, everybody started with local businesses, and you know, after around a 10-year period, you know, that was, some people might say that it was maybe war-related, but at one point, you know, it topped out. When we looked at the numbers, I think around like 1945, 1950, at one point, you know, like consolidation happened. I don't know if the same thing is going to happen. There's obviously economic factors at work. If you can't make a small business work, you might go out of business. But overall, the consumer, I think, is very different from, you know, the consumer like many years ago. Right.
The consumer wants to be differentiated, and given that the consumer has access to a lot of information, a lot of like storytelling, a lot of authenticity that they can find through, you know, like bloggers, through the suppliers providing like additional support, I think there is not anymore this monopolization of marketing channels that led to this consolidation between 1950 and 1990. Right now, I think there will be a much more fragmented marketplace, but it won't be 1,500 players that will all be big. There will be a very large number that will be very small. Some of them will go out of business, but there will be, you know, maybe 100, maybe 200, there will be significant players, and until they might get, you know, bought by the large suppliers in order to help them with their growth. So you could imagine a bigger multinational conglomerate at one point to own a bunch of these craft distillers, similar to what you see on the beer side. You look at Anheuser-Busch right now. Anheuser-Busch owns probably like a handful of different craft brewers, but overall, as a large company, you want to maintain a growth trajectory for your shareholders. If the consumer walks towards craft, you as a company might have to make an approach towards craft.
You had some really great insight. I really appreciate you sharing it with us here on Bourbon Blog and being here this weekend. It'll be great to follow the story and see how the industry grows.
All right, it's my pleasure.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Appreciate it, man.